Hi, my name's Sarah Davies, and thank you very much for taking the time to watch my video on how to incorporate Oracy strategies into the classroom. I think it's so important that we as practitioners look at how Oracy can be explicitly embedded across all education systems so that we can make sure that our students are prepared for life beyond the classroom and life beyond academia. Oracy skills are, of course, the fundamental part of communication, and those are the skills that we need to be embedding into our students as they develop and progress and prepare themselves for life after the classroom. So hopefully you'll see that some of these strategies, possibly some that you've done before, but possibly some that you're willing to do for the first time. My biggest hope is that we begin to see how we can embed Oracy explicitly into the curriculum to make sure that all of students are able to communicate effectively and to prevent, hopefully, any potential breakdowns in miscommunication that could have been prevented. Thank you. Hello and welcome to what I hope will be a whistle-stop tour of how to develop effective Oracy strategies in the classroom. My name is Sarah Davies and I'm the author of Talking About Oracy, and in this session what I hope to cover with yourselves would be understanding why explicit recognition of Oracy is fundamental to student development, how Oracy can be supported and can support behaviour in the classroom, and also what strategies could be used to support developing Oracy within your educational setting. Now, as we go along through this and as we focus, I think a fundamental understanding is why Oracy is so important to our curriculum. Now, Oracy is important and twofold. First of all, it can be perceived as an outcome and it is acknowledged as an outcome. The second is as a process, so the process in which we get to said outcomes. Now, when we look at it from an outcome perspective, we're talking about measuring spoken language ability. We're considering things like speech development for the younger early years setting and above, and obviously language acquisition as well. When we consider it as a process, some of the areas that we can consider there are the ideas of learning through talk, and this understanding of questioning and how we use questioning alongside collaboration and collaborative skills in our classroom. Now, when we consider why this is so important, I just want to draw light on just the level of intricacy that is involved with measuring Oracy skills during those early years. So between birth and 5 years, the matrix and the rubric that is used by many practitioners in order to understand how a child is developing. Now, the reason that this is so important is because when we consider Oracy and understanding Oracy, as soon as we leave that stage where we measure it against child development, actually it goes no further in regards to how we measure it, except for in an academic setting. So, for example, in our modern foreign languages and as a spoken language component on the English GCSE. Now, when we think about the importance of Oracy and why it's so important, we begin to get an understanding as to why just a measurement during that child language development at the beginning isn't necessarily the end point of our measuring an explicit recognition of Oracy skills. When we think about life after academia for our students, we need to be preparing them for exposure to informal dialogues with a variety of audiences, with formal meetings that may take place in whatever professional setting that they choose to go to, with how to address larger cohorts for those professions that they may choose to encounter or experience that involve such a skill, but also written forms of communication. And actually, through explicit Oracy recognition and through understanding the nuances that are connected to a well-rounded and effective form of communication, we therefore consequently become better at written forms. So understanding emails and letters and memos. And a prime example is the tones and the miscommunication that can come around through our understanding of how many different components are brought together to really engage with Oracy. Now, a prime example as to how to measure this is actually done using the Oracy Skills Framework. And the Oracy Skills Framework basically acknowledges, and it was designed by Oracy Cambridge and Voice 21, to acknowledge 4 key components that we need to consider when we are explicitly directing our students towards Oracy skills, and when we are saying or implementing in our curriculum the exact use of Oracy skills. We need to think about the physical side of it. We need to think about linguistics, about cognitive skills, and about the social and emotional side of it as well, and how they are all connected. A common misconception is that when we look at Oracy, we are just looking at the speaking skills, but actually it's speaking and listening. We're not just looking at speaking and listening skills, but we're also considering how our students effectively communicate. That involves that it is a two-way dialogue, that all of those concepts are being intertwined together, and that they are able to communicate effectively without fear of miscommunication. Now, one of the reasonings behind this is actually from a behaviour point of view. And us as practitioners, as we develop our craft, we begin to make an explicit reference to this, and we start to read the signs. But actually teaching our students how to do this and teaching them from a very young age will actually support with their own ability to communicate effectively. We and our students all need to understand the concept of being able to read the signs, being able to read the room, so to speak, how we communicate with people and how we read people and register their responses. A prime example is when we think about the concept of the use of the word "I'm fine," and how actually the word "I'm fine" can have so many different underlying references and meanings, and it's all about that contextualization. It's all about looking at the picture as a whole. Now, one of the ways that we can begin to do this with students from a very young age, even all the way up to college and university, is to be able to allow them to understand the different concepts when we look at our emotions and how we can communicate those emotions or how those emotions might be perceived. It's a prime example that when toddlers become frustrated, they become frustrated because they can't communicate properly. Babies cry because they don't know how to tell you that they're hungry or that they're tired. We get more and more agitated, or we get more and more frustrated if we feel like our audience aren't registering with what we're saying. So things like our resources that we can use to support our students and allow them to really develop this understanding are things like emotion wheels, allowing them to grasp the fact that you've got your initial interpretations of emotions, but actually we can delve deeper and we can go deeper into that and our understanding of those, and being able to provide a wider understanding of emotions consequently leads to things like a wider understanding of tones, a wider understanding of misconceptions, and how we may present ourselves and how this could actually come across. When we look at why this is so important and why miscommunication is so important, we then begin to understand reading the signs. And one of the things that I am adamant on is that these strategies are not just these strategies that we could use for our colleagues, but also for our students as well. And allowing students exposure to these really does develop their Oracy skills. So it's things like being able to think about and have an awareness of body language and considering how body language plays a fundamental role in what we say. But not also that, when we think about that social and emotional point of view, it's about discussing with our students that there are certain limiting factors to things like eye contact. So there are certain situations where perhaps and certain special educational needs, for example, where eye contact isn't necessarily a fundamental principle of whether or not that person is paying attention or not. Having those discussions with people really broadens and opens up their eyes to understanding how they might be coming across, but also how to deal and how to cope and handle different strategies with different people. We also need to think about tone. And as I mentioned before, one of the biggest breakdowns is a lack of recognition as how tone can play a greater part in miscommunication. It's all about thinking how that could come across, how it might come across as lackadaisical or sarcastic or aggressive even, and actually the consequences that could have of those. And also we need to, like I mentioned before, we need to contextualize the situation. We need to consider how we would react, how students would react. We need to get this idea across of being able to take a second to weigh up all the options and then to respond, instead of just making knee-jerk reactions or knee-jerk responses. Actually understanding and taking into consideration all emotions, all facts, all figures, anything that can be used and is there in order to make sure that you're providing a reasoned and justified response. All of this is taken into consideration when we look at why Oracy is so important, and we consider how it could actually be used, whether it be the teaching styles that you adopt. And I think this is an important time to recognise as well that at no point when we consider dialogic teaching strategies and monologic teaching strategies, and am I saying that one is better than the other? Same with facilitator and the same with instructor as well. I think what it all comes down to is this idea of contextualization and understanding the fact that you as the practitioner who runs that classroom will have specific strategies that you know would be effective in allowing your students to acquire the knowledge that is necessary. When you take that into consideration, it might be that actually throughout the course of a lesson that there are various different elements of dialogic and monologic teaching strategies. And I think an awareness of this is so important, and understanding the fact that Oracy skills isn't necessarily all built off of this idea where every single lesson is going to be collaborative, every single lesson is going to be group work, every single lesson is going to be a debate, for example. Actually, Oracy skills comes from this idea of, are you able to handle all situations? Creating a holistic approach to an individual's guide to effective communication. And it's about how we support that, but also ensuring, as I mentioned before with SEND needs, are we ensuring that all of our students are included and supported in this? Now, one of the best ways that I find supports inclusion is actually through this concept of triangulation. Now, triangulation is all about that collaboration, but not necessarily in a forced way. When we first embark on this venture into Oracy and how we can use Oracy skills, more often than not, one of the things that we're worried about are things like the noise, the degree of planning that sometimes needs to be involved in collaboration work, understanding the control of the classroom and the climate and the culture for learning as well, and making sure and ensuring that is completely focused on learning. So actually a really good starting point for me, and one that's not just a starting point, it's actually one that I consistently use again and again, is this idea of thinking, pair, and share. So think, pair, share. And we do it, we use it a lot, but it's that whole concept of why we use it. It's the same as why it's so important when doing things like questioning to give our students think time. More often than not, what we might find is that those students that are struggling with articulating their response would benefit from those discussions that aren't just with a peer, but actually with a group of peers, but building the confidence of what they want to say and how they want to articulate it comes from, first of all, being given that time to think and process the information by themselves, then being given the opportunity to articulate it on a almost like a surface level, and then that deeper knowledge acquisition, that deeper learning that takes place from being able to share the findings and the fundamental responses that come from it. Now, there are some other strategies that I'd like to point out and I'd like to highlight that could be useful when starting or considering how Oracy can be used in your classroom. The first thing that I'd do is actually look at your own midterm plans and your curriculums and consider where you already use it and how you already use it. Particularly if you are introducing Oracy skills to colleagues, actually it's about an explicit awareness of what is already there, but also why it is so important and how it can allow our learners to progress. It's not just a subject-specific skill. It is, of course, the responsibility of all practitioners to ensure that their students can communicate effectively. And actually, if a school does that properly, those students go on to a higher level of degree of success, just purely because of the fact that they're able to communicate with people effectively, a variety of different audiences in a variety of different circumstances. So some strategies that I've seen used, I've used myself in the classroom, include the ABC questioning. That's always good when you've got those groups that perhaps may not have collaborated with each other before, may not have had those discussions. You might find that more within the secondary and the college, but also, as a starting point within primary settings. That ABC questioning, it allows for almost like a scripted starting point. It is the form of debate, but it allows students to understand how debates or how discussions can be had in a way that is articulated reasonably and in a reasoned response as well. We also talk a lot, and I talk a lot about it in my book as well, about a Socratic questioning and this idea of deeper questioning. And I feel that's a fundamental part of it all. The reason that Oracy is so important when we think about knowledge acquisition is because it allows our learners the chance to really get into deeper understanding and a deeper level reflection of whatever subject it is that they're learning. Take, for example, when you're looking at literature, the idea and the opportunity to incorporate Oracy skills prevents this lack of confidence that comes from having to write it all down. It allows you to explore things further without fear of failure or without this idea of having to get everything down quickly. I talk about as well this idea of the talk through walk through. Now, talk through walk through is exactly what you see when you model those responses. But it's that opportunity to discuss it as opposed to just be writing it down. I would actually say that this is a way to do it before you do the written model and the written approach. Okay, how would we answer this question? And actually, what that allows for, if you adopt questioning in there as well, is students to see sometimes just how easy a question is. Because if they're able to discuss it there and then, and you go, right, okay, you've done it. That gives them a greater level of confidence. That, alongside a modelled written walkthrough, adds to this level of certainty and this level of confidence that we really want from all of our students. We talk about self-reflection discussions as well. One of the strategy, what we want to create whenever pupils do extended pieces of work or whenever pupils are consolidating that knowledge, giving them the ability to verbally explain where they've gone right and where they've gone wrong without this fear of retribution, without this fear of consequences from it, allowing them to really truly get to the heart of their own personal reflection. What you might find there is that you're not getting the generic responses. They're able to talk about it and discuss it. And actually what that does is that builds that confidence level again. And finally, the collaborative response building. So when we talk about collaborative work, one of a key strategy, if you want to include the wider groups, and if you want to really allow people to gauge with different perspectives as to how to develop a piece, is collaborative response building. And that is a group of 2, 3, 4. I wouldn't necessarily go with any more than 4 because that's too many voices trying to be heard at the same time. but 2 to 4 individuals all building responses. What that'll allow you to do is expose to students the different strategies that could be incorporated to building a perfect idea. Now, these are only some of the strategies available. I would like to point out that it's all about incorporating strategies that you can use with your students in your setting. You understanding your students and considering their needs is what really drives forward the explicit use of Oracy in the classroom. When you do start to look at Oracy skills though, and when you do start to develop those Oracy skills, what I would suggest doing is following the stages in order to really ensure that you are establishing those Oracy skills. Now, I can't take credit for this. This, of course, is courtesy of another practitioner who, in my book, provided me with some information on how they establish Oracy in primary schools. But I really like this idea of understanding that it comes in stages. And it's about those stages and why those stages are so important to building on how you develop Oracy skills. And it's about being able to plan, to reflect, to monitor, and to be able to share those good practices as well. And it's very much a cyclical structure with Oracy. Whenever you are looking at Oracy, I do stress you do have to make sure that these strategies are embedded before you truly reflect on them and you truly evaluate whether or not they are the most effective for you. Allow them to become embedded in the classroom, because if we just dip our toes into different strategies, that just gives us a surface level understanding as to what can be most effective for our students. We really want to get to the heart of how we can develop those effective Oracy strategies in the classroom. Now, thank you very much for listening to me today. I hope that you enjoyed this. If you do have any more questions, I am, of course, available on Twitter at sjdavies87, and it has been fantastic to have you join me.